Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. To a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. You see, the medieval castle at night wasn't all ghostly howls and dragon bones settling under the floorboards. To be fair, the wind did make a convincingly dramatic creak through the narrow arrow slits, and the moat frogs enjoyed a robust choral practice sometime after moonrise. But beyond that, despite what Hollywood might suggest, the nights were mostly filled with the soft symphony of a stone building settling in for its rest. And of course, the chorus of human murmurs drifting up from wool blankets and straw-filled mattresses. Let's imagine one such castle. Nothing too dramatic. This isn't Camelot. Nobody's pulling swords from soup ladles. This is a smaller keep, somewhere in the rolling hills of 12th century England. There are sheep in the distance. There's a smell of turnips in the air. And yes, the turnips are winning. The sun has just ducked beneath the trees, and the resident bell ringer, a stooped man missing 2 teeth and 1 shoe, drags the hem of his cloak through the mugwort patch on his way to toll the vesper bell. Bong, bong, bong. It's more of a clunk than a melody, honestly. But it does the job, signaling that bedtime is nearing and it's time for evening prayers, porridge, or ideally both at the same time. Within the inner walls, a torch snuffles and flickers in its sconce. A guard lazily scratches the stubble beneath his nasal helmet and debates whether it's worth unlacing his boots before napping on duty. He decides no, the boots stay. This is the kind of bold decision-making that marked life in the great halls of history. Now, you may imagine that castles were drafty places, and you would be right. Every night had just a hint of outdoors about it, a fresh reminder that insulation hadn't yet been invented, and your tapestry-covered wall did more to impress noble visitors than to keep your kidneys warm. In the women's quarters, Lady Winifred pulls a woolen hood over her nightcap, as was the style at the time, to retain both modesty and marginal body heat. Lady Winifred's maid, a bright-eyed girl from the village named Elsweath, extinguishes the last of the wall sconces using the old iron snuffer that's been passed down through at least 7 other slightly clumsy women. Candles were expensive after all, too valuable for idle burning. Fires were doused responsibly. In short, medieval castles were about as OSHA compliant as a sack race in a torch maze. Down in the kitchens, the last pot of oat porridge sputters near the hearth. The cook, a formidable woman with arms like ham hocks and a deep mistrust of raisins, stirs idly with a ladle that might double as a rowing oar. She listens for mice skittering in the thatch and mutters half a prayer to Saint Ulrich, the patron saint of stomach conditions, just in case she was heavy-handed with the goose fat again. Meanwhile, in the chapel, which smelled permanently of beeswax and frowning, Brother Oswin is locking up the psalter and nodding along politely as another monk reports sightings of a mysterious blue glow in the hallway by the relic cupboard. Experience tells him it's likely the moon reflecting off the polished helmet of Sir Bernard, who sleepwalks in full armour and once tried to tilt the herb garden at 2 a.m, muttering about cabbages inheriting the throne. The scriptorium cat, by the way, has indeed been fed. Oswin remembered just in time, a humble dinner of boiled bones and whatever bit of herring came loose from the monk's supper. The cat responds with precisely the gratitude one might expect, licking its paw, narrowing its eyes, and promptly throwing up behind the baptismal font. Outside the walls, all is dim and damp and largely unconcerned, owls chortle from the treetops, mice nibble hastily under barn eaves, and the stars hang heavy over the battlements like silver pebbles suspended in dark soup. Soup, notably, was also a common midnight snack, assuming your chamber pot wasn't closer. By now, everyone is tucked in, not necessarily under blankets as we know them, more like under layers, wool, linen, a scrap of fox fur if you were lucky. The lesser nobles used hay, with the occasional surprise of a wayward beetle. There wasn't much tossing and turning, mostly because if you shifted too much, you'd wake the 4 other people sharing your bed. Entire families nestling together like sausages in a non-stick pan. And so the castle settles. A final mouse scurries. A final yawn echoes out of the barracks and off the stone walls like a ghost with a sinus condition. The wind rustles the edge of a tapestry depicting St. George with an improbable chin and a deeply confused-looking dragon. Sleep descends slowly, like a velvet curtain, warm despite the stone, soft despite the night. And whether you're a monk, a maiden, or a marmalade-coloured cat curled tight in the vestry loft, all is quiet now. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Just after twilight, when the sun had finished its slow-motion swan dive beyond the hills, the castle began to inhale. Not with lungs, of course, those are less common in stone-based life forms, but with sound, layers and layers of it, like an orchestra that hadn't yet rehearsed. A low, rumbling cough from deep in the kitchens, the creak of timber as the upper floors settled ever so slightly, and the irregular tinkle of chamber pots being emptied from windows with an enthusiasm unseen in modern plumbing. You see, nights in a medieval castle weren't silent. Far from the romantic swoon of moonlight and a lute solo in E minor, they sounded more like a boarding school crossed with a minor natural disaster. Let's start in the Great Hall. By day, this was the social nerve centre. Knights comparing scars, monks pretending not to eavesdrop, minstrels playing variations on "Please don't fire me, sir." But by night, the hearth was banked low, the rushes on the floor crackling softly under the weight of mice having high-stakes arguments over crumbs. The tapestry-lined walls did little to muffle the ambient snores of squires curled up on benches, trying to pretend they didn't hear the knight they served talking in his sleep, usually to his horse. Above them, the Lord's chambers. He had his own room, which in 1302 was as good as having indoor Wi-Fi. Luxurious. His bed, a carved wooden thing that loomed like a ship with curtains, was stuffed with straw, feathers, and perhaps 3 or 4 brave squirrels that had wandered in during construction and taken oaths of fealty. The sounds here included the sleepy murmurings of old soldiers, because even noblemen dream in chainmail, and the occasional thud of a leather-bound book falling off the side table. It would often be The Consolation of Philosophy, a popular read among medieval aristocrats who liked to ponder life's futility while wearing velvet hats. Next to his chamber, the Lady Solar. Or in the evenings, her reading annex/miniature spy office. Noblewomen weren't just standing around all day gazing out of arrow slits. Especially by candlelight, a proper noblewoman might spend her evening mending embroidery while quietly dictating letters, checking on estate revenues, or subtly adjusting the allegiances of half the local nobility via strategic cousin marriages. The sounds here were of quills scratching parchment, goblets being refilled with wine from a clay jug, and the faint rustle of parchment being concealed whenever someone knocked. Then there were the guards, the poor saps unlucky enough to draw the graveyard shift on the battlements. Short straw duty among short men in long chainmail. perched high above the sleeping halls, they stood silently, but their armor didn't. Chainmail is, acoustically speaking, the medieval version of bubble wrap. It pops, squeaks, and jangles the moment you try to be stealthy. Add to that the occasional sneeze from the cold. Not to mention private conversations muttered into the fog. Things like, "Did you hear about Roger? Fell into the moat again. That's the third time." Down below in the dungeons, or as they were known back then, basements with trust issues, you'd hear dripping, always dripping. No one knew from where. Some thought it was leftover Roman plumbing. Others blamed the monks. Unlucky prisoners might add to the soundscape with groans, mostly complaining about the rats, which were unfairly blamed for everything from plague to unsolicited bed warming. In reality, a medieval rat had hopes, dreams, and frequently very high standards in cuisine. They would avoid stale bread, but they'd absolutely steal your cheese tokens if you fell asleep too, hard. And away from the stone and torchlight, out in the surrounding countryside, the castle's outer wards added to the nocturnal performance. Farmers, tucked into wooden cottages outside the walls, might be heard snoring into half-eaten turnips. Dogs barked at passing owls. Roosters had the occasional early midlife crisis and crowed far too soon. Yet amid all this sleepy chaos, snorts, drips, whispers, creaks, there was a strange kind of peace. A rhythmic, layered quiet. A castle asleep but alive. Its people dreaming of harvests and jousts, of love letters and soup recipes, of dragons they'd never meet, and chickens they had named personally. Because even in an age of legends and lords, the night had its own comforting predictability. Every groan of timber, every muttered prayer in Latin, every echoing drip was just another lullaby. One that wrapped the ancient walls like a warm, woolly blanket, knit by time itself. And if we wander a little deeper now, around a quiet courtyard and beneath a sleeping archway, we'll find another secret eddy of sound waiting for us, just down these cool stone stairs. The moon had peeked out, just barely, like a shy servant from behind the heavy stone curtain of the clouds. Its silvery light spilled across the crumbling crenellations of the great keep, those iconic notches at the top of castle walls that, contrary to popular belief, were used far less frequently for epic battles and far more often for pigeon congregations. Honestly, the average medieval archer spent more time scaring off birds than invaders. Inside the castle, nestled in the thick stone belly of its cold corridors, life was beginning to quiet down. But quiet in a medieval castle was a relative term. If, by some miracle, you'd gotten used to the clang of a distant pot being scrubbed with what suspiciously resembled a horse brush, or the soft thudding of goats who had broken into the great hall again, there were still the floorboards, and the groaning stones, and the mystifying sound near the pantry that everyone insisted was just the wind, but which sounded suspiciously like a disgruntled monk with indigestion. And yet, as strange and noisy as it all was, there was something deeply comforting about it. Everything had its place, even the mysterious pantry ghost, possibly named Gregory. Above stairs, a steward was doing his nightly rounds. A steward, in medieval terms, was something of a professional warrior with a ring of keys so large and jangly it could double as a self-defense tool. Known for being sleep-deprived, overworked, and somehow always holding a torch at just the right romantic angle, stewards kept the castle humming, or at least wheezing along adequately. Tonight, our steward, Master Oswin, was inspecting the tortuously long hallway near the guest chambers. He walked with the purposeful shuffle of someone who has put on precisely the wrong shoes for nighttime corridor duty. With each echoing step, another tapestry fluttered quietly, as if gossiping among themselves. These tapestries, by the way, were more than just fancy medieval wallpaper. They were hunks of woven wool designed to keep the cold out, the heat in, and at least one cocky draught from Wales firmly outside the chamber of Lady Maud, who'd been blaming it for her stiff neck since Tuesday past. The scenes embroidered on these vast woolen murals ranged from epic battles, which might have been more impressive if the knight in the corner didn't appear to be sword-fighting a very large chicken, to mysterious allegorical imagery that probably meant something to someone once, but now just felt like a fever dream of a monk on too much mead. As Oswin passed the chapel, he heard the low thrum of hymns echoing up from below. A handful of monks were practicing nocturnes, not the Chopin kind, sadly, but the devout Gregorian kind. Long, haunting chants designed to praise the holy and, if not careful, lull you directly into sleep. Their voices flowed under the door, somber and velvety, like wine spilled in slow motion. Then there were the dogs. Yes, every good medieval castle had at least a few dogs slumbering somewhere inconvenient. They were not necessarily guard dogs, though they barked with such commitment that visitors often assumed they'd been specially trained. In truth, they were more likely to be tripping hazards than loyal protectors, especially when they chose to nap in surprisingly strategic locations, like directly in front of the latrine entrance or halfway up a staircase, daring anyone to break their neck. At this hour, the great hall stood quiet, but not entirely empty. The fire had dwindled low, leaving only a lattice of orange coals glowing under the ash like a sleepy dragon's breath. And nearby, slumped over a goblet of what he swore was medicinal wine, the castle bard had fallen asleep mid-stanza, quill still tucked behind one ear, mouth open in vague astonishment at a dream only he would remember. It wasn't unusual for bards to doze off like this. Having memorized approximately 14,000 verses about tragic battles, doomed lovers, and what happens when you mix up a prince's birthday song with a funeral dirge, awkward. Some exhaustion was inevitable. Elsewhere, torches guttered in iron sconces, spitting the occasional hiss and crackle. This wasn't dangerous necessarily, unless you were wearing too much wool and leaning too close, which frankly was all the time. And through it all, a faint, ever-present sound, the stones breathing, or rather expanding and contracting ever so slightly, warmed and cooled by the fireplace below and the chilly breath of midnight air above. The castle, in its own way, exhaled now, settled. Somewhere in the high towers, a night watchman shifted, blinked blearily over the battlements, and let out a private sigh, blissfully unaware that he'd dropped his helmet into a bucket previously occupied by pickled fish. So, onward the night unfolded, full of snoring hearth-hounds, chanting monks, tapestry whispers, and the distant sleepy chronicle of a place older than memory, and nearly as draughty. And as the castle finally found the rhythm of true moonlit rest, some curious creaking turned our attention to the wooden stairwell, where someone or something was just beginning to stir, if you were somehow lucky, or possibly unlucky, enough to drift off in a medieval great hall after a day of watching a turnip fermentation contest. The night would creep toward you softly, but not silently. No, silence was a rare delicacy in medieval castles, usually reserved for two kinds of situations. The brief moment after someone asked, "What's that smell?" and the even briefer moment before a hound started barking at it. Around twilight, the castle would heave a great, creaky sigh. Doors groaned with that distinct, "I've been oiled never" kind of moan. The last clattering of trenchers and goblets would echo through the stone corridors as the household cleared away the remnants of dining. Bread crusts, mutton bones, and one very brave pea nobody dared to eat. The hearthfire popped and hissed, occasionally belching sparks like it had its own agenda. And it did. In fact, hearths were central characters in the medieval nighttime symphony. Their snap crackle was less gentle lullaby and more angry porridge demon. But after a few hours, it began to sound oddly comforting. Meanwhile, upstairs, if the castle had enough spare money for upstairs, noble chambers settled into their own chorus of creaks. Beds were not yet the plush marshmallows we nestle into today. Oh no. These were grand wooden thrones of discomfort. 4 poster beds made from entire disappointed forests, with straw-filled mattresses and enough creaking timber to make one wonder if the headboard was possessed. Which, in popular medieval opinion, it occasionally was. Down in the servants' quarters, snores began to rise up through the floorboards with surprising volume and variety. Medieval snoring was symphonic. The cook had a low, droning rumble like a soft cow rolling down a hill. The stable boy's snore was bird-like, possibly due to sleeping sitting up next to actual birds. And the steward, old Master Emmerich, emitted a kind of whistling wheeze that harmonized eerily with the whistling wind through the arrow slits. Now, the wind, true diva of the castle nightscape, was never content to merely blow. It moaned through the battlements and sang to itself in the stone stairwells like a ghost with theatrical tendencies. It rattled shutters, fluttered tapestries, and sometimes, if it was feeling particularly artistic, it would thrum across the top of a half-barrel in the cellar, producing something that sounded pretty close to a medieval didgeridoo. Rats, of course, did their part, usually auditioning for the role of tiny, nocturnal percussionists. Their little claws pitter-pattered across stone floors, sometimes in pursuit of crumbs, sometimes in pursuit of each other, and sometimes in pursuit of something that may or may not have winked at them from the hole in the storeroom wall. Historians refer to this as not our problem. Somewhere in the corner of the courtyard, a guard coughed, rhythmically, as if composing a ballad of his own lung condition. Guards were supposed to be quiet, watchful, and alert, but many were mostly cold, sleepy, and philosophically resigned to life in wool leggings. They murmured to each other in low tones, discussing high matters such as who had filched the last onion pie and whether or not the ghost in the North Tower had improved its juggling. The animals, of course, had a strict bedtime schedule. Chickens roosted early, muttering clucks of complaint at anything that disturbed them. Pigs snorted with alarming volume. One goose, inexplicably parked right beneath Lady Marjorie's window, honked at regular intervals as if keeping time for the entire estate. It had survived 3 Christmas feasts already, possibly due to its bravery, but more likely due to its terrible meat-to-attitude ratio. And yet, despite the cacophony of creaks, coughs, crackles, snores, snorts, and surly poultry, there remained something oddly serene about a castle at night. The heavy stones held a kind of hush beneath the noise, a historical hush, as if the very walls were listening, to dreams, to sleepy lies, to whispered prayers mumbled while eyeing the ceiling for spiders. Eventually, even the wind tired of its performance, the fire slumped low, and the castle wrapped itself in the stillness that only deep, honest fatigue can bring. The sort of stillness that comes after a long day of surviving soup accidents, arrow polishing, and one awkward priestly sermon about the dangers of excessive mirth. And as the moon slipped over the battlements, casting silver across mossy stones and quiet flagstones, we drift now to the parts of the castle that stayed just a touch warmer than the rest. Places where tapestries swayed and secrets dozed behind wooden panels. Let's gently follow that flickering candlelight deeper, toward the more tucked-away corners of the medieval night. The night winds swirled about the battlements like gossiping old monks, whispering tales to the granite stones that had heard everything and in equal measure cared for nothing. Down in the cobbled courtyard of the castle, a dull thud broke the stillness. Sir Ethelbert's favourite boot had once again fallen from his second-story window. It was an almost nightly event. Some claimed it slipped during his nightly prayers. Others said he'd made unwise dinner choices and sleep flung it mid-dream whilst jousting an enormous roast goose. Whatever the case, the boot, fat, wool-lined and tragically odorous, landed with the solemnity of a dropped cake on Midsummer's Day. Not that anyone stirred. The castle's nightscape was no cacophony of clanging armour and shouting guards, as the bards and motion pictures might suggest. No, the ambience was more, let's call it livestock-centric, accented by the occasional melancholy note of a lute, whose player had definitely given up on stardom but still practiced whenever their in-laws visited. Goats, for one, never truly slept. They took casual naps, as if forever suspicious that someone might be plotting a surprise sermon. They were excellent climbers and even better eavesdroppers. And so, while the lords and ladies snored beneath fur pelts, atop prickly mattresses stuffed with straw and the occasional hedgehog in residence, a goat named Matilda softly pattered across the parapets. Her hooves clicked like distant castanets on stone, her gaze full of judgment. Inside the great hall, a fire still smouldered in the hearth. The castle's great hall fire, once a roaring beacon of authority and warmth, was now a slowly exhaling dragon of embers. Above it hung great tapestries, each telling a grand tale of conquest, or at least some lord's deeply exaggerated hunting weekend. At night, they rustled faintly as the wind snuck through ancient cracks, sounding far more like snoring grandfathers than one might expect from textile. Near the kitchens, things got spicier, scent-wise and socially. The scullery maids, who handled more fish heads than any fairy tale villain ever dared, whispered their nightly gossip over crusts of pilfered bread. Whispers, even at that hour, were currency, sometimes richer than silver. Which knight had smiled at which milkmaid? Which chamber pot had been flung in a marital misunderstanding? And which noble, poor soul had developed an alarming allergy to scented soaps? They laughed with the care of practiced house cats, quiet, nimble, and utterly aware of their right to exist. Somewhere above them, beyond a winding stair, and beneath two unforgiving beams where pigeons plotted their rebellions, the barracks breathed gently. Rows of snoring guards sprawled across basic straw pallets, each blanketed with wool and fortified with dreams of battle glory. One perhaps mumbled something about a bread pudding ambush. Another gave a heroic snort, expertly synchronized with the creak of a shield on the wall. The castle's soundscape at night was less a din and more a low, comfortable muddle, the kind of noise you'd expect from a large family of insomniac marmots. There was always something. A guard humming to himself, a candle guttering with theatrical flair before darkening, the whistle of wind sneaking beneath the portcullis and straight into someone's boots. And in the chapel, lit only by moonlight sneaking through stained glass saints, a monk dozed mid-prayer, his head gently bouncing against a wooden beam. He would not wake until matins, or possibly until his own snore startled the cathedral mice into stamping their tiny protest. Stillness, yes, but never silence. Silence, in fact, was a luxury the medieval castle never quite discovered. It had all the elements of peace: sleeping inhabitants, smouldering coals, a guard rotation of mathematical simplicity. But nestled amidst it all thrummed this ongoing living murmur. Even the stone walls, frosted slightly from the chill, seemed to emit the contented sigh of a structure doing its job. Protect, shelter, echo amusingly, and repeat. As the moon lazily crept across the high windows, and somewhere a cat made an operatic leap onto a windowsill purely for drama, the castle, our snoozing stone beast, kept dreaming along with its residents. But there, beneath the floorboards and behind shutters best left unopened, another layer of sound stirred. Less comforting, more mysterious, that faint scratching, almost rhythmic. But we'll come back to that. Somewhere deep inside the stone stomach of a medieval castle, long after the hounds had stopped barking and the last hearth smoke curled lazily toward the rafters, another sound stirred. Not ghostly moans or clashing swords, but the unmistakable creak of Sir Reginald's knees. Yes, contrary to popular fantasy portraits, knights were not so much graceful warriors as they were armoured scarecrows with stunningly awkward daily routines. Now, Sir Reginald, a man who had taken 3 oaths and 4 wives, but still couldn't walk across a hall without knocking over a stool, was one of many reasons why castles always had a bit of nighttime noise. You see, a knight didn't simply go to bed. He performed a small operatic tragedy involving 30 pounds of metal, 2 confused squires, and quite possibly a hasty prayer that gravity would show mercy that night. Strip away the glamour, and you'll find that castles at night wheezed and breathed like great creatures settling into uncomfortable slumber. Every wooden beam above strained and whispered with age. The wind, a part-time banshee, found clever ways to slip through arrow slits and call down stone corridors in odd, almost gossip-like tones. Usually, something along the lines of, "Did you hear what the cook did to that eel?" Speaking of the cook, let us divert our attention now to Baldwin the Browbeaten, who had spent the better part of his day roasting, boiling, and quietly resentful. Kitchens in castles were ancient, smoky theatres of chaos, and long after the great hall had gone quiet and the lords were unbuckling their belts with kingly grunt satisfaction, Baldwin was still down there, scrubbing a cauldron the size of a small horse. The night sounds from his corner, the slosh of sudsy water, the scrape of a tunic across splintered benches, and, more frequently than you'd expect, muffled swearing about parsnips. Above him, somewhere in the feasting hall now dormant and haunted by echoes of exaggerated stories and wine-spilled confessions, the great chandelier creaked gently. Its chains whispered with each passing breeze, and if you listened, just right, you'd swear it was sighing under sheer boredom. But perhaps the most curious sounds of all came from the garderobe. Not the most dignified place in the castle, mind you, but easily one of the more vocal after sundown. A thin stone chute, essentially a castle's answer to plumbing, led human contemplations down into the moat, and what a chorus they inspired. Plop, plink, splash, the nocturnal symphony of the lower levels. Now, many castle dwellers believe spirits live down there. Not ghosts, no, but a more persistent breed known as moat goblins, who thrived on discarded chamber pot contents and whispered all night in bubbles. Most likely frogs, of course. but let the medieval mind have its fun. Outside, in the courtyard, horses stirred in their stalls. Hooves thumped sleepily against wooden planks. One particularly sarcastic mule, known by all as Little Thomas, had a habit of braying precisely at midnight. Some believed he was mocking the tower guards, who were required to yell out the time hourly, even when the village didn't own a single clock. "Midnight bell, all clear," said the guard. "Hee-haw," replied Little Thomas, ever the cynical timekeeper. In the servants' quarters, the lullaby was whispered conversation and straw rustling. Beds were hardly beds, more like ambitious baskets of hay wrapped in old cloaks. Stories echoed softly there, tales of ghosts, of fae. Of that time, the laundress accidentally boiled Bishop Wycliffe's undertunic into a hand towel. Even the very stones themselves, warmed by day and now cooling in the thick, damp night, gave off their own little creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure that had survived sieges, weddings, and 6 generations of misbehaving noble children. A castle didn't snore per se. It settled. It digested the day, and not all noises were unwelcome. The crackling of a dying fire in the solar above, a nurse softly singing in early Middle English to a baby who would probably someday inherit a title and a severely uncomfortable hat, and the distant clink of a watchman's armour as he fumbled with a wineskin, all wove together in the gentle, lilting lull of night in the medieval world. So if you ever drift asleep and dream of living in one of those towering stone fortresses, remember this: between the knees of noblemen, the moaning of moth-eaten tapestries, and the outspoken plumbing system, a castle at night wasn't quiet. It was curiously alive. And somewhere, in a narrow stairwell, where no one but spiders ventured, a door creaked open with the sound of things yet to be discovered. Somewhere past the hour of the owl, and just before the rooster rehearsed an early solo, the castle kitchens yawned back to life. Not because anyone was hungry. In fact, no one dared snack at these hours unless they fancied a brush with medieval tooth decay, but because of a most sacred late-night ritual: bread rising. While the sheer rest of the castle slumbered under scratchy wool and a collection of fleas that could qualify as family pets, the baker's apprentice tiptoed across cold stone floors with the clumsy grace of someone half asleep and entirely bread-focused. He carried a bundle of dough the size of a small hog and the texture of someone's regrettable attempt at a foot bath. Now, bread in medieval times was no casual affair. It wasn't just toasted and forgotten like today's supermarket loaves. It was the staff of life, the carb cradle, the grainy glue holding medieval society together, socially and sometimes literally, depending on what got stuck in your teeth. Tonight, though, something peculiar haunted the baker's quarters. Not ghosts, though those have their own union and usually work Thursdays, but a strange sound, a low, gurgly hum, like a contented frog singing soprano into a wooden mug. Our apprentice paused, blinking into the candlelight. "You again," he whispered to the lump of dough, which had recently taken to vocalizing during fermentation. This wasn't entirely unheard of. Bakers sometimes said a dough sings when it breathes just right. But this dough was definitely singing something suspiciously close to a tavern song about a knight and a goat. He listened. Yes, there it was again. "Oh, Sir Tarquin, oh, Sir Tarquin, you danced with goats and now you're barking." The apprentice chalked it up to sourdough madness, the condition of having spent too many nocturnal hours communing with fermenting cultures and gossiping with a loaf. He gently patted the dough, muttering, "Less troubadour, more gluten development, please." Meanwhile, just above the kitchens, in the Lord's Hall, 2 watchmen had taken up their midnight post by the great fireplace. The one on the left was attempting to stay awake by counting how many beams made up the ceiling, and the one on the right, a rather wistful fellow named Osric, was crafting limericks about porridge. There once was a knight from the Shire, he recited softly, who sat on his codpiece by fire. He said, "'Tisn't right to eat gruel every night, but at least 'tisn't full of haywire." The other guard twitched. What in God's name is a haywire? Osric shrugged. Something I imagined crawling out of the stew. Their lightly whispered nonsense joined the castle's nighttime orchestra, the occasional thud of water dripping into a forgotten basin, the creak of wood stretching under the weight of centuries, and, far off, the rhythmic grunts of pigs dreaming of truffles. Even the iron chains from the portcullis echoed gently in the wind, knocking like a ghost with very patient manners. Then came the rustle. Not from the mice, those medieval acrobats of the granary, but from the castle chapel. It was subtle, reverent, like someone flipping pages very slowly, or a sermon being whispered by the walls themselves. In truth, it was Sister Henrietta, whose insomnia had intensified ever since the arrival of the relic, a saint's toenail fragment currently encased in glass just beside the altar. Henrietta wasn't sure if the relic was holy or just oddly shaped, but ever since its arrival, strange dreams had seeped into her sleep like water beneath a door. Tonight, she wandered softly across the stone floor in stockinged feet, mumbling verses in Latin and occasionally swapping them with housekeeping notes to Saint Benedict, just in case he listened after dark. Et liberare nos a malo. And if you could also possibly nudge Brother Matthew to wash his robes a bit more often. All across the castle, the night was a lullaby of oddities. Bread that bubbled like it bore secrets. Guards who composed poetry about gruel. A nun confiding in a saint's toe, and weaving through it all the deep, abiding breath of the castle itself, nestled in shadowed stone and endless history. Sleep came slowly, not dramatically, but like honey sinking into bread, thick, quiet, familiar. And above the great hall, beyond the kitchens, and just past Sister Henrietta's half-Latin humming, one window cracked open in the breeze, a tower chamber where someone, perhaps a scribe or a wayward servant, turned a page, preparing for the sounds of the great hall come morning. A warm summer night folds itself over the sloped roofs and soot-darkened chimneys of a 13th century English castle. The sky a deep velvet puddle of stars, and the moon casually judging everyone from above like a silent nobility auditor. Inside the stone belly of the fortress, the day's business has finally wheezed to a halt. No more clanking armor, no shouted orders from red-faced stewards, no impatient neighing from stablefuls of horses that, frankly, would rather be wild. The great hall, once abuzz with the muffled stomps of heavy boots and the occasional lute solo that overstayed its welcome, is now much quieter, though not yet silent, because silence, in a medieval castle, is like a unicorn, mysterious, hypothetical, and mostly whispered about by the wishful. You see, as the castle settles in for the night, it begins to murmur in its own curious cadence, not with human voices. Those are mostly snoring in upper chambers or whispering gossip into straw-filled pillows, but with the quieter language of timber beams and mortar seams. Medieval walls talk in their own way. Timber shifts in response to nighttime moisture, creaking like old knees. Roof slates tick and tock as they cool, and behind every third wall somewhere, a mouse is hosting a cheese summit. Tiny thuds from the beams, that's just mice arguing over the Gruyere, Below stairs, the castle's kitchens are sleepy, but not entirely abandoned. A dying hearth crackles softly, its embers glowing like the last bits of gossip from a scullion's lips before bed. And somewhere past the wine barrels, in the cool, shadowy dark of the cellar, a cat named Thomasina patrols, silent, solemn, and absolutely judgmental. She squints at a rat that squeaks a little too loudly and continues on her rounds like the furry sentinel she is. Above, in the noble chambers, sleep comes draped in sounds. A noblewoman's elaborate hairstyle finally rests against embroidered linens, nearly smothering her noise-muffling coif. Her maid, curled upon a rush mat at the foot of the bed, snores unashamedly. The noblewoman pretends not to notice, partly from etiquette, partly because she's focusing very hard on not thinking about all the spiders that also call her chamber home. Indeed, spiders are terribly loyal to castles. They cherish the same things nobles do: warmth, privacy, and a delightful view from the ceiling. Some spin webs between candle sconces. Others prefer tapestry corners, especially those depicting saints for spiritual reasons. Contrary to popular belief, medieval spiders were not more aggressive than modern ones, but they were possibly more literate, being frequently read to during scribe training sessions. Meanwhile, far above, in the castle tower, where wind and owl calls braid themselves into lullabies, a watchman stands at his post, or at least leans convincingly. His halberd rests more against the wall than in his hands, and his eyes hover between alertness and a pleasantly defiant drowsiness. It's a quiet night, a blessed relief after last week's incident involving a troubadour, a weasel, and one poorly mended battlement. From the turret, the night stretches out in all directions. Muffled croaks from frogs drifting up from the moat, the occasional bark of a hound who has seen a suspicious leaf, and on the wind, a faint melody blown from a distant village where someone is playing a flute. Badly, yes, but with enthusiasm. Within the castle walls themselves, there are other sounds, not loud, not frightening, just ever-present. The rustle of reeds underfoot on the chamber floors, sighs from those stirring in sleep, and the regular drip of condensation from a stone arch onto some poor servant's forgotten shoe. And there, yes, now it starts. The monk in the scriptorium murmurs softly in Latin. He can't sleep again. Something about the shape of a letter G in a recently copied manuscript has unsettled him. Was it Gothic? Was it Carolingian minuscule? Should he return to the chapter on ink mixing ratios? These are the torments of a medieval scholar's soul. Even the very air of the castle carries its own tone. Musty from the stone, sharp with a hint of boiling vinegar from the morning's preservation efforts, and occasionally floral when the breeze unkindly stirs the rushes in the garderobe shaft. So no, a medieval castle at night never truly slept. It hushed. It leaned into stillness. But from groaning beams and rearranging rats to sleep-talking scribes, its nighttime chorus hummed on. Outside the tower, the moon begins her downward course across the sleeping countryside, brushing light across tiled roofs and parapets. And deep within the castle, even the ghosts have decided they'll float more quietly tonight. Let's drift onward, where a secret stairwell might just echo with something more than footfalls. By the time the moon had clambered halfway up its nightly ladder, draping a soft silver shawl over the stone walls of the castle, the inner courtyard had settled into that uneasy equilibrium of quiet that actually isn't quiet at all. The sort of medieval hush that's stitched together from clinks, snores, muttered Latin, and the occasional goat with boundary issues. Let's drift now toward the chapel, the small, candlelit heart of the castle's spiritual life, where silence was holy and knees were calloused. Despite the iron discipline expected there, the nighttime vibe was more ambient Latin spa, minus the eucalyptus. Many medieval castles had their own chapel, typically wedge-shaped into the corner of the inner bailey, backed up to a solid wall, as if holiness needed a little extra structural support. Depending on the hour and the piety of the Lord, evening prayers might echo quietly within. A low chant of Salve Regina from the in-house chaplain, his voice thin with age and devotion, slipping through stone like warm smoke. But chapels at night weren't all angelic harmonies and divine light. No, sometimes the holiest echo was interrupted by an unmistakably unholy sneeze from Brother Matthew, who had a persistent candle smoke allergy and the self-control of a half-baked turnip. According to the rules, one should sneeze unto a cloth, but Matthew had never quite mastered the cloth part, much less the aim. Near the chapel, tucked into a narrow cloister walk that smelled faintly of rosemary and stern warnings, sat the scriptorium, a modest little room where texts were copied by candlelight and quills scratched like tiny papery mice. Though officially closed at twilight, on some nights, a particularly enthusiastic monk would sneak back in, hoping to finish a particularly juicy marginalia of St. Cuthbert fighting a snail. You see, medieval monks had a flair for the dramatic in the margins. While daytimes were spent translating theological treatises, evenings, when the abbot wasn't watching, might see little doodles of sword-wielding rabbits or resentful cats sliding their way between psalms. Occasionally, the scratching would stop with a hiccup of guilt, as the monk remembered he was supposed to be in bed. Bed here being a glorified hay shelf with an itchy woolen blanket and visions of eternal salvation. Or cheese. Medieval dreams were heavy on religious imagery and dairy products, we're told. From chapel to cloister, the sounds were gentle, subdued. But then, if your ears were especially attuned, you might detect the strange nocturnal ritual that happened just a few corridors away, the ceremonial inspection of the roast goose. This wasn't a nightly occurrence, to be fair, but on feast eves, a frequent event in the medieval calendar, which was about 40% theology, 30% feast preparation, and 30% medieval digestion. It was customary for the castle steward to double-check the main course. Picture it, a barrel-chested man named Geoffroy, always with an I to sound dignified, trudging into the castle kitchen by lantern light to whisper heartfelt warnings to a defenseless, half-cooked bird. "Don't disappoint me tomorrow," he'd say to the goose, which blinked not at all, being previously braised and extremely dead. And oh, the kitchens. Even at night, faint smells clung like loyal ghosts to the stone. Burnt barley, onions at various stages of enthusiasm, and the constant comforting tang of stale mead. A boy apprentice, clearly too smitten with the head cook's daughter to sleep, might linger near the embers under the unconvincing pretense of turning the ashes. All these little echoes and aromas drifted toward the great hall as if reporting in for bedtime duty. On some nights, a breeze sneaked through the high arrow slits, catching old tattered banners in the rafters and setting them to mild applause. This too was a castle's lullaby. Stone and wind, chant and coals, all brushing the edges of dreaming. Above all this grandeur and ghoulish lay the Lord's chamber, presumably still battling the haunting hoot of the night owl, who had taken glorious residence atop the garderobe chute. For months, no one could catch it, and frankly, most people had resigned themselves to the fact that his lordship now had an owl roommate, The owl, to its credit, was perfectly polite, but deeply judgmental. And so the castle breathed. It did not sleep, not truly. But it turned down the volume, dimmed the echoes, and drifted into the kind of half-wakeful hush that castles have practiced for centuries. A practiced stillness stitched together with straw, stone, psalms, and sniffles. Deeper into the night we go now, where sleep grows heavier and mystery begins to whisper through the cracks of the courtyard stones. Somewhere behind the thick, knobbly walls of the castle's eastern tower, the clocks, if they had any, would have been quite confused by now. But of course, in medieval times, clocks were notoriously unreliable creatures. Most of them weren't clocks at all, but monks squinting at candle drips or hefty bells tolling approximately whenever Brother Thomas remembered that the sun probably wasn't where it used to be. This particular night, though, no bells rang. The monks had long gone silent, tucked into their stone alcoves with full stomachs and half-considered prayers. Outside, the moon sighed its pale light across the battlements, as if it, too, was settling in for a bit of well-earned peace. And deep within the keep, tucked behind creaking oak doors and iron hinges that sounded suspiciously like groaning ghosts, the castle breathed in that peculiar hush that only comes when everyone assumes someone else is on night watch. And so it was that the castle at night became an orchestra of forgotten chores and anonymous sounds. One long lullaby performed not by harps, but by half-washed pots, sleep-slurred snoring, and the occasional distant ow from someone very much regretting walking barefoot through the torchless corridor. But in the scullery that overlooked the forgotten gardens, something peculiar rustled. Not the sound of danger, no, just the sound of medieval indigestion, a phenomenon rarely discussed in scrolls or heroic ballads. You see, medieval cuisine was a curious affair. By modern standards, nearly everything was either overspiced, overboiled, or accidentally crunchy. Salt was precious, honey was currency, and refrigeration was a fantasy reserved for wizards and unfortunate polar bears. In short, food went adventurous, and stomachs by consequence became troubadours of their own kind. Lady Cecily, the Baroness's second cousin and renowned avoider of turnips, had spent the feast gorging on spiced eel pâté, thus sealing her fate. She now lay awake, wrapped in fur blankets made from animals no one could identify, listening with dread as her internal organs debated mutiny. Elsewhere, in the servants' quarters, someone snored the way a rusty gate might if it had strong opinions about hay prices. That was Gwillem, the stable hand, a man whose dreams often included winning a pie-eating competition judged by talking sheep. His snores bounced off the stone walls, harmonizing with a far-off gravelly muttering. A sentry talking to himself, perhaps, or just practicing the insults he wished he'd hurled at that French merchant earlier. Up in the high tower, the wind whispered secrets through the arrow slits. It sounded like ghostly gossip, not frightening, mind you, more bemused. After all, many of the so-called ghosts that haunted medieval castles were actually just cold air, bad echoes, and untrained cats knocking things over. Ah yes, the cats. Oh, they were very real. Long before cats were internet celebrities, they reigned supreme in medieval castles. Quiet, judgmental, and utterly indifferent, they padded through narrow corridors and great halls alike, forever on the hunt for rodents, which were also not shy after dark. To the peasants, they were useful. To the nobility, they were elegant. To themselves, they were gods. Every now and then, one would pause dramatically before a tapestry, stare fixedly at a patch of wall that had absolutely nothing happening, and consequently terrify any passerby into believing the spirit of a long-dead duke had arisen. Really, it was just Maurice the cat, deeply invested in a speck of dust. Down in the armory, a guard rearranged his chainmail for the third time, attempting to sit comfortably, a task as achievable as sleeping on a bed of spoons. The links jingled softly as he shifted, echoing through the corridor like metallic rain. He didn't dare unbuckle it entirely. Ever since that incident with the rooster and the false alarm about invading Celts, which in fact turned out to be a picnic party from the next estate, everyone was expected to maintain some level of working armor, even in their dreams. Hovering between silence and clatter, between whispered drafts and feline acrobatics, the castle hummed a nocturne all its own, a sort of sleepy shuffle of wood settling, metal sighing, stomachs protesting, and wind gossiping. It's easy to imagine that history was always grand, valiant speeches, flaming arrows, and banners snapping dramatically in the wind. But sometimes, history simply sounded like a hiccup in the dark and a confused rooster crowing at 2 a.m. And this, dear listener, brings us comfortably onward to one of the most underestimated stars of any medieval night, the chamber pot, that humble, hidden hero of after-hours necessity. A hush falls over the stone passageways of the castle as torches sputter in iron brackets, casting sleepy shadows on ancient, dusty walls. But the silence is deceptive. There's a nocturnal symphony unfolding deep within this medieval fortress, a soundscape not of wind or wolves, but of crusty chamber pots and creaking drawbridges, of drowsy guards and mice with ambitions. Let us drift now into the chambers of the lower ward, where the castle's heartbeat thumps on even as the stars begin to blink. Somewhere near the buttery, a misleading name, unless you were expecting storage for barrels of beer rather than sticks of butter. A young kitchen boy turns over on a straw-filled pallet, smacking his lips and muttering a sleepy complaint about turnips. These apprentices slept near their posts, largely because there weren't enough hours in the day not to. Medieval kitchens started preparations before sunrise, and the bread didn't bake itself. It just looked like it wanted to. Beyond this humble sleeper lies the kitchen proper, and just... Let's listen. Hear that? A faint scratching sound like a gentleman's quill pen dragged across wood grain. That's Henry, the unofficial rodent in charge, patrolling the spice cupboard with all the dignity of a duke. He has already clawed a hole in the sack of dried rosemary, and now his nightly promenade includes a stop by the beef-dripping jar. Castles were like five-star resorts for mice. If you liked your cheese aged, your breadcrumbs plentiful, and your cat slow and philosophical. Now up the narrow stairs, hunched beneath a curved stone ceiling that gave even the most proud knight a posture problem. Somewhere along these stone arteries of the castle, a guard shifts on his feet, the soles of his cinched leather boots whispering against flagstones polished smooth by centuries of pacing. He yawns, though trying to look serious while doing so. His torch throws a familiar flicker across the interior corridor. He's counted every groove in the wall during his shift, and, yes, that one still looks like a pig snout. The guard isn't just on duty for enemies, who rarely arrived at night, primarily because high-speed sieging wasn't invented yet, but for fire. Fire was the true night terror. You'd think a building made of solid rock would be fairly flame-resistant, and you'd be mostly right. But then you recall the wooden roof beams, the rushes underfoot, and the tapestries that absorbed smoke like gossip. The smallest candle left unattended could start a slow-motion disaster. a fact deeply appreciated by castle guards and fellow light sleepers alike. In the Lord Solar, that's the fancy medieval word for living room that also might double as an office, dining room, guest suite, and tax processing center. The sputtering fire has died into embers. The pets, surprisingly numerous for a world that barely had toilets, snore gently. Hounds with saggy eyes and world-weary expressions are curled in tight circles by the hearth, twitching at dreams of rabbits they never quite caught, but pursued with noble inaccuracy. The lady of the manor, if not yet asleep, may be finishing her embroidery by the light of a single candle, her fingers sore and her mind wandering. The patterns on the tapestry are more than decorative. They're storytelling in stitches, and sometimes, just sometimes, contain sly winks to current events. A unicorn with the face of a bishop. It's happened. Further deep within the castle's bones lies a part few venture into at night. The garderobe. Yes, the medieval toilet chamber. If you've ever admired a castle's overhanging towers and thought them purely architectural bravado, know this: they often contain garderobes, projecting proudly over the walls so waste could drop directly into the moat. It added an unexpected layer of strategy to anyone foolish enough to assault the castle from below. During the quiet hours, the occasional whoosh and plop from one of these lofty lavatories might echo down the outer walls. Inside, the air is thick with lichen, mildew, and occasional regret. Yet, to defenders, there was no finer luxury than indoor plumbing, gravity-assisted, rudimentary, and scented primarily by whatever herbs could be stuffed into the walls. Lavender and inconvenience. Somewhere, a goose honks in its sleep. Yes, the poultry, tucked into a warm pen near the kitchens. Geese doubled as alarm systems and hung humorously between livestock and security measures. Their midnight mumbles were like feathered mutterings against the darkness. And, overhead, in the cold rafters above the great hall, bats creak into motion with leathery wings, fluttering across the vast, vaulted air. They weren't treasured per se, but they helped with the bugs, and the bugs helped with the romantic notion that castles were somehow gloriously immune to nature. The castle, at night, is a breathing, murmuring chronicle of creaks and coughs, snores and scratches, and 1,000 quiet labours to keep the fortress from collapsing into the quietly feudal chaos it contained. Its sounds may be strange to modern ears, but here, in the heart of the stone giant, they're lullabies in disguise. Let's follow that sound, the distant splash of water in the courtyard's central well. There's a story there bubbling up through the stone, and it's where we'll gently wander next. As the moon hung like a polished silver coin over the ramparts, much of the castle had finally gone still, or at least as still as a structure filled with livestock, guards with indigestion, and drafty wooden floors could ever really be. One might assume that with the nobles and servants tucked in their respective wooden cocoons and the torches guttering low, the air within a medieval castle would embrace silence, a sacred hush. But oh, dear listener, that's only if your definition of silence includes snoring contests and the occasional ghost-stirring groan from the plumbing that wasn't actually plumbing. You see, castles of the Middle Ages were constructed largely for defense, not acoustics. Thick stone walls carried sound in strange, whispery ways, like a 12th century game of telephone where everyone was mumbling through a mouthful of barley. And even when you tried to tiptoe, be you servant, scullery boy, or one of the castle cats, you might as well have been marching with cymbals. Every creaky board and clinking buckle seemed to echo like a trumpet call announcing your imminent ankle injury. Among the loudest contributors to the nightly drama was the great hall, long since deserted after supper. Tables wiped but not washed, candles snuffed, and trenchers scraped free of goat cheese and gossip. But the ghosts of banquets past had a way of haunting that room. Surfaces still smelled of onions and broth, and sometimes a brave late-night rat or two made their own midnight banquet, gnawing on a forgotten crust as if auditioning for a rodent symphony. And the noises had layers. Oh yes, glorious, peculiar layers. From the kitchens below, where no stove was ever truly cold, you could often hear the last of the embers sighing under slumbering stew pots. Iron chains clinked as they cooled, a kind of culinary lullaby whispering, "Tomorrow, more porridge." The kind of peaceful promise that made you wonder if medieval digestion truly ever paused. Higher up, in the guard towers, men rotated shifts in a state that hovered between vigilance and deep, wheezy napping. The soft crunch of a guard biting into an emergency biscuit blended with the occasional cough, often more dramatic than necessary, as if their lungs too wished to stay in fighting shape. One could always count on the midnight guard to hum. Not actual songs, mind you, but that strange medieval hum that exists somewhere between a Gregorian chant and the noise you make when trying to remember where you put your sword. And now, let us speak of Sir Hoofington. He was not a knight, but a resident warhorse, stabled just beneath the West Wing. His legacy was glorious, if you believed everything told by the tasks assigned to him, which, by this point in his career, consisted mostly of snorting, sighing, and routinely knocking over a water bucket between the second and third watch of the night. Sir Hoofington's midnight tumbles were so punctual, some sleepy guards took them as their cue for a snack break. Climbing yet another layer up the castle, like the layers of a very uncomfortable onion, we arrive at the tapestries. Oh yes, the tapestries had their own lives. You must imagine coarse fabrics hanging heavily on drafty stone like sleepy nobles wrapped in centuries of dust. Occasionally, a breeze would stir one, prompting a slow flutter, and with it, a faint scratching noise as if the unicorn stitched into the scene had itchy hooves. Rats most often, but sometimes just a timid breeze pretending to be something more poetic. Perhaps the most surprisingly loud of all, however, were the noble snores. Lords and ladies alike were not exempt from the nightly noise parade. Their chambers may have been opulently draped with feather beds and heavy curtains, but none of this dampened the symphony of sleep sounds. Picture, if you will, a stately duke gargling his dreams through his nose, while his lady cousin snorted her way through a lullaby of murmured regrets and cautious optimism. If the tapestries were to write a lullaby, it would be scored in the key of congested. And then there was the wind. Ah, the wind. That ever-faithful accomplice to medieval insomnia. It threaded through arrow slits and danced across battlements, turning each parapet into a shrieking pipe organ. The very ventilation of the castle seemed determined to keep itself entertained, low hoots followed by long moans, as though the castle itself had opinions on who should truly be king. All in all, the stillness of night was more like a quiet chaos, a rustling, groaning, clanking harmony that no bard dared transcribe. And so, as the stars travelled lazily across the tower tops, and Sir Hoofington shifted in his stall for Chapter 52 of Splashy Bucket Theatre, a new sound stirred gentle curiosity, the soft creak of a door in the eastern corridor, one not touched since last Michaelmas, but that dream waits patiently around the next shadowed corner. By the hour the stars crawled higher into their velvet thrones, the castle's many noises softened into a lullaby of small oddities, Gone were the clanging swords of day-training knights and the shrill declarations of poultry conducting civil war in the courtyard. Night at a medieval castle did not fall so much as it crept, aided, perhaps, by the soft-footed stealth of chronic draftiness, echoing oddly off the stones. Inside the keep, where stone corridors yawned like sleepy mouths, the air carried the aromatic rumours of roasted turnips, burnt lamp oil, and aged wool that had made peace with its destiny. The servants had retired, leaving only the steady plip, plip, plip of water working its existential crisis through a leaky gutter and into a wooden bucket that neither enjoyed its job nor complained about it. Meanwhile, higher up, in what we would generously call the tapestry-laden guest chamber, a nobleman from a neighbouring region was discovering that medieval hospitality included both an ale-soaked mattress and the thrilling experience of livestock sounds echoing up through the floorboards. A goat, somehow still awake, offered restless commentary from the kitchens below with occasional bleats of discontent that, to the half-asleep traveller, might well have been a ghost trying to remember its lines. Then there was the castle's clock, only not quite. The clock was in fact Edgar the stable boy, whose main duty at sundown was to walk the perimeter with a torch and loudly announce the hour to no one in particular. This system was only loosely accurate, but well loved. Problem was, Edgar had no training in horology, and mostly guessed based on constellation placement and his bladder. His call of midnight and a bit echoed from the battlements, rousing a sleepy pigeon roost, who cooed in weary protest and flapped once, just to make a point. In the kitchens, Mistress Winifred, the cook, snored gently beside the hearth, having fallen asleep mid-rumination on cabbage stew. Her dreams featured competitive turnip peeling and a cheese wheel that frowned in disapproval. The larder mice, organized and unionized from years of bureaucratic oversight, tiptoed in formation to retrieve stored crumbs, whispering in tiny voices like gossiping monks. Even the fire in the great hall, once mighty and crackling with political debates and hot tallow gossip, now reduced itself to the sound of wood deciding whether it had burned long enough. Occasionally, a log gave a dramatic pop, as if reminding the cold stone room that it was, in fact, doing its job quite brilliantly. Thank you. Through the arrow slits, the wind found its voice, a little theatrical that night, sighing along the stairs like a spectral uncle who couldn't find his keys. Every now and then, it would cause one of the wooden doors to creak open slowly, and equally slowly shut itself again. These sounds have been widely misinterpreted as hauntings. Really, it was architectural personality, and deep within the dungeon, which, to be fair, mostly functioned as an overstock pantry and general time-out zone for impolite monks, there were whispers, not ghostly ones, but those of Cedric, the part-time scribe and full-time conspiracy enthusiast, who'd locked himself in overnight to copy a manuscript he was sure contained secret instructions from St. Scholastica on how to properly fold a robe. His candle flickered, the scratching of his quill blending with the distant hoot of an owl who, from the belfry, believed himself the spiritual overseer of all nocturnal happenings below. Up in the ladies' solar, gently tucked behind thick velvet curtains, a lady of rank lay resting, half covered in knitted blankets and flanked by her two lapdogs, Clarence and Marjorie, both of whom snored with aristocratic restraint. The moonlight crept in as if asking permission, and the room held the serene quiet of embroidery left mid-stitch and thoughts of weekends at the Abbey Spa. Her dreams were narrated by monks with charming accents, and involved an argument between two troubadours over who had worn the feathered hat best. And just outside the castle walls, a pair of guards patrolled with the vigilance of men who had, once again, forgotten the code to let each other back in after a bathroom visit. Their armor clinked, their torches flickered, and their stomachs grumbled in unison. An angry ensemble of digestion and discontent. For in the tapestry of night in a medieval castle, every sound stitched itself into a dream. Timber whispered, stones breathed, feather mattresses, though technically just sacks of straw with identity issues, sighed beneath their sleepers. It was a marvel not of silence, but of sleepy murmurs, the kind that cradle you, slowly, sweetly, into the soft belly of slumber. Of course, as moonlight slid across the floor of the castle chapel, something strange stirred just beneath the altar steps. But that's better left for later. As midnight hummed through the cracks in the stonework and owls blinked sagely from the rafters, the castle hummed too, but not with ghosts, as the torch snuffers might have sworn, nor with secret lovers, though they were abundant and often disappointingly noisy. No, this hum came from something altogether more predictable: digestion. Not the digestion of the nobility, mind you. Their feast had already inspired enough groaning to resemble sea monsters doing yoga. The real composers of the midnight melody were the castle's work animals, creatures who, unlike their human counterparts, had excellent gut health and no dignity whatsoever. In the shadowy corners of the stables, horses snored with a kind of whinnying resignation, occasionally punctuated by a sneeze of hay. Donkeys, ever the pessimists of the medieval bestiary, muttered their thoughts into the straw, and the cows, sweet, philosophical cows, chewed cud to the rhythm of their own bovine lullaby. The pigs, however, were wide awake. This was their plotting hour. Pigs in medieval castles were not simply bacon resources waiting for inspiration. They were mischievous, clever little creatures who found the quiet night perfect for low-stakes rebellion. Having spent the day wallowing in a socially sanctioned mud pit, a rare perk in an otherwise hierarchy-obsessed world, they liked to use the nighttime to root underneath things. Flooring, gates, expectations. Sometimes their snuffling could be mistaken for a priest praying fervently in the crypt. And just above them, in the kitchen hearth that never truly slept, embers glowed like the eyes of an old cat who's seen too much. The kitchen stillness was occasionally interrupted by the clink of a cooling pot, or the sigh of bread giving up its last bit of steam. The castle cook, a fearsome woman named Maud, who could flay a salmon with the speed of gossip, had layered the hearths with fresh logs before retiring, grumbling, as always, about knights who expected pigeon pâté and couldn't tell quail from a pigeon with nice shoes. From below the kitchen, where larders lurked in cold smugness, came the faint hope of cheese. Wheels of it, aging methodically like contemplative monks, filled the storerooms. Some even had names and relationships and possibly grudges. Medieval cheese, especially blue cheese, was practically sentient. Imagine a tiny choir of fermented voices humming their mouldy sonatas as rats performed synchronized crumb foraging below. Meanwhile, in the great hall, the echoes of the evening's loud tales still lingered with the smoke. Traces of spilled ale turned sticky on the long wooden tables, and goblets abandoned mid-anecdote glittered like tiny pewter altars to inebriation. The fireplace in the hall had settled into a lull, its logs giving one final pop as if clapping for themselves. Above all of this, far up in the musicians' gallery, where minstrels had once performed with far more enthusiasm than pitch, lay a half-tuned lute someone had forgotten. Every so often, the night breeze plucked a string, giving the illusion that a ghost was trying to debut a folk album. But of course, these intrusions were minor compared to the main event of Castle Night sound, the guards' complaints. Stationed at various posts with halberds, spears, or, if unlucky, nothing but a torch and a sense of doom, castle watchmen were among the most vocal participants in the nocturnal soundscape, not due to courage, but boredom. They whispered ghost stories they didn't believe, gossiped in hushed tones about lords whose eyebrows were definitely bewitched, and sang off-key songs about tavern maids with questionable hygiene but unparalleled pies. One such guard, named Edwin, had a reputation for whistling when nervous, which he did, nightly, with all the tuneful horror of a kettle trying to learn Latin. Past the guards, atop the towers, the wind made its final claim on the night. Here, the soundscape turned philosophical. The wind hummed through crenellations like the breath of an ancient, patient god. Banners flapped lazily, and weathercocks spun or stuck, depending on their mood. Owls patrolled silently, and bats darted like punctuation in the sky's long, droning sentence. The castle was never silent. It was alive with sound, not loud ones, just persistent ones. The sounds of masonry settling, boots creaking, and echoes from the day drifting into the stone like dreams waiting their turn. And so, as the moon reached its highest point, and a dog barked at absolutely nothing from the outer, Bailey, the castle, for just a moment, exhaled. A soft, unified breath of straw and soot and rumours. It was time now to drift a little deeper, to follow that sigh through the trapdoors and arrow slits, and into a quieter chamber still, where dreams rustled like velvet, and even the statues stopped pretending to listen. The courtyard quieted as the moon climbed higher, her silvery gaze illuminating the worn flagstones with a light that might flatter the castle's craggier corners. The torches were guttering now, orange halos dancing their final curtain call in iron sconces, while the last of the gossiping servants trailed away like smoke, vanishing behind wooden doors and stone staircases. The great hall had given up its clamour, and even the stables mumbled in their sleep. But just as one might think the castle had at last surrendered to silence, a curious chorus began to emerge, soft and muffled, yet unmistakable. It was the sound of sleeping people, not snoring nobly like in the epic romances, or even snoring politely, as one might expect from someone wearing chainmail pajamas. No, this was a cacophony of snorts, wheezes, huffs, and tiny, high-pitched whistles that could make a sack of hedgehogs look coordinated. The lord of the manor, comfortably wedged into his carved oak bed, produced a low, rumbling growl in tempo with each exhalation. The lady, beside him, but well shielded by 2 good pillows and a decorative tapestry showing the martyrdom of St. Wilgefortis, whom she'd selected mostly because she liked her beard, responded with an occasional sniff-honk combination that sounded vaguely like a goose in agreement. The serving boys, sleeping in the loft above the buttery, had adopted a sort of group rhythm, as if their collective snoring required rehearsal or was part of a guild obligation. One snored on the inhale, another on the exhale, and the third simply murmured fragments of dreams that strongly suggested he thought he was a duck. Medieval dreams, you see, were intrinsically tied to one's last meal, and pottage before bedtime could do strange things to the subconscious. Down below, the castle dogs, at least 3 of which had noble titles and questionable hygiene, offered their own midnight solos. A hound near the hearth rumbled like an old bellows, while a small and particularly anxious terrier whimpered occasionally. chasing some phantom rat across the flagstones of sleep. From the tower overlooking the eastern walls, the night watchman's whispers could occasionally be heard, not to others, but to himself. He talked quietly to his shoes, named them both, and held patient debates with the left one about whether barn owls were messengers of death or just very intense birds. The right shoe, in these discussions, mostly agreed. And near the kitchens, nestled away from fresh drafts and perhaps closer than advisable to the pickling room, slept the castle's official night baker, a role invented entirely to justify someone having access to pastries at inappropriate hours. The baker dreamed of flying tarts and talking gooseberries, muttering, "You'll never conquer Swindon," to a flock of accusatory scones. Outside, the nocturnal world continued its quiet performance. Owls hooted from hidden perches with a tone of mild judgment, as if dissatisfied with the state of astronomy. A fox trotted by the outer wall and paused, perhaps reflecting on the peculiar noises issuing from the bread oven vent, before deciding not to investigate. No good ever came from following the scent of medieval croissants. And somewhere near the well, just beyond the herb garden now folded into shadows, a couple of mice held a squeaky conference, possibly regarding castle-wide soundproofing improvements. Their minutes would be misplaced by dawn. You might imagine castles were silent paragons of nighttime serenity, but in truth, they were more like sleeping orchestras without a conductor. Each chamber contributed its own odd melody, the shifting of straw mattresses, the creaking of timbers responding to temperature, the gentle tap of a loose shutter finding its rhythm in the breeze. Even the wind seemed to inspect each arrow slit with professional interest, testing chords and trying new notes, like an ethereal musician weighing a haunting tune. And it was in this strange symphony of involuntary noises, haphazard harmonies, and serendipitous snorts that a medieval castle truly found its voice in the hours before dawn, somewhere deep in the undercroft, an echo of something metallic, possibly a spoon falling for the third time tonight, reminded the walls that they were never truly alone. The stone kept secrets, yes, but it also kept sounds, storing whispers and murmurs in tiny crannies, like a cautious archivist who greatly enjoyed gossip. And as the stars arced their slow ballet above, and the castle hummed and sighed in its sleep, something else stirred, something not quite human, not quite ghost, and wearing something suspiciously like a bell-adorned cap. By now, the torches on the outer curtain wall were flickering low, their once bold flames reduced to gentle orange size. Castle courtyards doze under a quilt of dew, and the only thing bolder than moonlight on wet flagstones is the confident pacing of a wise old goose. Always underestimated, the goose, yet often more effective than a sleepy watchman with a cheap ale habit and a limp. Inside the castle walls, where the air held just a whisper of damp linen and smoked barley, the resident kitchen cat, Dorcas, had assumed her nightly dominion. With the majestic arrogance only a tabby of advanced years can carry, she stalked the pantry corridors with paws soft as treacle, and an expression suggesting she alone understood the secrets of the feudal system. If someone had asked her, she'd probably declare herself Lady of the Larder. As night fully settled into its slippered rhythm, castles transformed from overwhelming toll structures of defense into oversized sleepovers for several dozen restless individuals, mixed animals, and at least one ghost that never quite figured out the afterlife's exit instructions. The noble family slept slightly better than the common folk, of course, though that's not saying much when your mattress is mostly straw with gently used feathers, often donated posthumously by a slightly surprised goose. Even the Lord's bed, grand and glorified with hangings of embroidered scowling unicorns and saints with oddly short thumbs, didn't keep out the draught that crept under the tapestries like a gossiping cousin. Outside the Lord's chamber, a squire named Athelred was on the 4th hour of trying not to fall asleep while standing upright, a skill he was almost certainly failing at. To the casual observer, he looked like he'd mastered a sort of interpretive wobble dance, something between guard alertness and sleepy lunge. His helmet had begun to tilt slightly leftward, a sure sign he'd be asleep before matins. But oh, poor Athelred, he was not alone. All over the castle, servants and stewards dozed on benches, slumped against stairwells, huddled near hearths like sentient bundles of cloaks and exhaustion. One laundry maid named Ismine had taken refuge in the warmest spot she knew, atop the barrels of laundry water warming near the kitchen fire, head resting softly on the folded tunic of someone else's tomorrow. She dreamed of cherries, or bells, probably both, and beneath it all, deeper than most footsteps remembered to descend, the castle vaults and cellars exhaled their cold breath into the stones, a place of pickled fish, dusty ledgers, abandoned casks, and the occasional slightly haunted helmet. During the day, bustling with butlers and barley, but at night, it became the realm of echoes and things that didn't quite decay properly before inventory. Here, a rat named Osbert ruled in reputed silence, though beneath floorboards he hosted nightly feasts with dried apple cores and stale oat crumbs as delicacies. He was a generous host, provided you didn't touch his wedge of hard cheese. He'd earned that thank you. Up above, the wind now slid through the arrow loops like the hush of a librarian mid-prayer. It muttered things in Old English, perhaps, or just the murmurs of weather caught thinking aloud. Tower bells, unrung and rust-flecked with time, stood vigil, listening to those hushes. You see, there was music in the castle at night, but it wasn't played. It was heard. In the creak of beams settling their pride, the drip of water rehearsing revenge, and the gentle, nasal bray of a night's snores from the solar. There existed, at the top of the North Watch Tower, a particularly dreamy illusion. The guards there, said to be the most alert, had learned over time to sleep with their eyes nearly open, providing the illusion of vigilance while dreaming of spit-roasted venison and romances involving courtly love and wildly inaccurate astronomy. Even the dogs, bred to alert their masters to any nighttime invaders or the threat of missing bacon, were now curled into cooperative rings of fur and indifference. Their tails gave occasional nervous flicks, perhaps chasing phantom intruders in the corridors of their dreams, or perhaps just fleas. Down in the chapel, the stone felt warmer somehow. Perhaps it was the stored prayers echoing still. A lone candle, lit by a devout old monk who had since fallen asleep halfway through Vespers, bobbed gently as the wax surrendered. There was peace in the forgotten nooks of faith, where centuries of whispered devotion had polished the pews more than any servant's elbow could. It was in that stillness that the castle seemed to breathe, sleeping not as stone, but as memory suspended in time. And somewhere, just above the stable rafters, a pigeon finally settled its wings, but the hour was not done yet. Elsewhere, something unexpectedly musical was stirring. Something made of strings, sheep's gut, and the truly misguided ambition of a bard with more confidence than chords. Down in the bowels of the castle, where light dared not linger and breezes only visited when summoned by a draughty whoosh, lay the kitchens. Not the elegant kind where one might imagine goose being basted and pears poached in wine, but the nightly reality of a medieval kitchen. Soot-brushed walls, firelight flickering on copper pots, and a soundscape that could only be described as bubbling, squeaking, and the occasional thud of something mysteriously falling down. Throughout the day, the kitchens were ruled like a kingdom within a kingdom. The cook, often more feared than the lord of the keep, kept everyone in line with their ladle scepter and an iron glare. But at night, once the fires had been dampened and the last pot scrubbed, or at least quietly abandoned behind a barrel, the room changed its character. It became a half-forgotten, echoing cave of scents, shadows and sounds not immediately traceable to anything visible. One of the most common and underappreciated nighttime companions of the castle was the stealthy rattling of the grain barrel. Rats, you see, don't punch a time clock, and in a world where pest control involved cats and prayer, it was common to hear a curious scurry thump well after the nobles had snuffed out their tallow candles. Occasionally, a startled mew would echo as the kitchen mouser, who considered himself semi-retired, was awoken into action. His attempt at re-establishing dominance usually ended with a dramatic crash, a patter of fleeing paws, and the proud presentation of something tail-equipped by morning. Then there was the bread. Yes, even the bread made noise, at least according to the most poetic scullions who worked the night shift and were perhaps overly familiar with yeast. Baked in massive loaves that hardened into medieval doorstops if not consumed immediately, the remains of the day's bread could be heard resettling in their baskets. A soft creak here, a almost imagined crackle there. If one lay very still and let their ears drink in the silence, it almost sounded like the bread was sighing. Grateful, perhaps, not to have been turned into trenchers and filled with a stew so mysterious it simply went by the name Tuesday. But the loudest, and some would argue most unnecessarily dramatic, sound of the night emerged from the spice rack, because no self-respecting medieval kitchen left their spices unguarded. Even gravity wasn't trusted with them. Secured on high shelves or boxed into locked chests, the single clink of a glass bottle tipping over in the stillness could summon half a dozen ghosts and a wide-eyed novice cook muttering oaths in Middle English. Being responsible for spilling the Lord's stash of imported saffron was considered only slightly less dangerous than committing high treason, and probably involved more shouting. And let us not forget the ever-simmering cauldron. In reality, most fires were tamped down for the night, but any stew left to mature overnight had a voice of its own, a kind of sleepy bloop, bloop, echoing faintly around the hearth. There was something hypnotic about it, as though the very essence of the castle's diet was dreaming itself through the broth, reciting the herbaceous lullabies passed down from onion to leek. Some castles had night cooks, preparing food for soldiers returning from patrols or insomniac nobles, who could not be comforted by even the most talented of lutes. These night cooks were often elderly, wise, and slightly hard of hearing, which meant they could move through the kitchen undisturbed by both mice and men. The lifting of a lid, the soft rasp of a ladle on the bottom of a pot. These sounds were less like cooking and more like stirring memories into the night air. Altogether, the medieval kitchen at night was a chorus of ghosts. Not the spooky sort, but the leftovers, sounds, and scents that lingered quietly, waiting patiently for dawn. Anyone sneaking in under moonlight in search of a snack would find themselves welcomed by a warm coal's glow, the whispery exhale of resting bread, and an occasional feline stare that suggested you'd better share your cheese. It turns out, one does not need a roaring feast to find life in a castle kitchen. Sometimes, it's in the softest footfalls, the curl of smoke, or the gentle bubbling of an ambitious stew that the true spirit of the place comes alive. And as the kitchen dozes, well-fed and surrounded by the soft murmur of memories and mischief, a few corridors away, a different sort of nighttime ritual begins. One involving torches, troublesome locks, and the burden of keys the size of dinner plates. Somewhere past the bats in the belfry, beyond the yawns of rusting portcullises and the creaky lull of timber beams contracting. In the cool night air, there came yet another undersung sound of medieval castles, the nightly rounds of the castle watchmen, also known as the original sleepwalkers, but with more chainmail and less direction. Let us gently tiptoe back under the stars of the 13th century. The air is damp, sweet with moss and distant sheep. On the walls, torches hiss and flicker like they're whispering secrets into the stone. And all along the battlements, boots are scuffing in a slow, rhythmic pattern that's halfway between a patrol and a poorly choreographed medieval musical. You see, not everyone in the castle was sawing lumber with snores by this hour. A few unfortunate souls, namely the night watch, were wide-eyed and pacing atop the walls, armed with little more than halberds and a few slightly resentful thoughts. Medieval castles may be romantic in hindsight, but from the perspective of a sleep-deprived guard standing on a frosty parapet with only the wind and a stubborn owl for company, they were slightly less enchanting and slightly more mildly miserable. These guards took turns walking the length of the curtain wall, peering into the darkness for would-be attackers, wolves, and the occasional drunken noble trying to find the privy the long way round. Every so often, the guards might pause to strike a bell or rap their spear against the stone, just loud enough to let the others know they hadn't dozed off and tumbled into the moat. This was the medieval version of pinging the group chat, or airing grievances to the stars. Back inside, the captain of the watch sat tucked beside the hearth in the guardroom, a small chamber near the gatehouse that always smelled faintly of old stew and new anxiety. He'd be listening for trouble, or more often, pretending to listen, while nodding off with his helmet in his lap. No judgment. His job was hard, and chainmail isn't exactly as breathable as modern pajamas. But the most curious component of the castle's nocturnal collection was the watchman's horn. If real danger approached, perhaps a raider sneaking through the trees or a cow wandering suspiciously close to the curtain wall, the guard on duty would let out a series of booming horn blasts. The goal: to wake the whole castle faster than a rooster with a megaphone. Depending on the castle's size, this could mean 2 hoots, 4 blasts, or in some cases, simply yelling, "Oi, trespass!" Of course, these emergencies were rare. Most nights were uneventful, with nothing more threatening than a stray hedgehog meandering through the courtyard. But protocol is protocol. Every fuzzy footstep, every shifting cloud shadow, it all had to be considered, pondered, and perhaps jabbed slightly with the blunt end of a spear just in case. Sometimes, if the night was especially slow and the stars were generous, the guards would lean against a merlin and share stories. Quiet ones. Ghost stories about the last noble who died in a duel over a crooked tapestry, or tales of the haunted latrine, where several knights claimed to have seen a pale figure wielding a chamber pot. To pass the time, they played guessing games about who snored the loudest in the dormitory below. Master Fitzwarren was a regular contender, and place bets on how many rats would pass through the granary before sunrise. Spoiler: always more than 3, but fewer than 12. Their murmured laughter would trail into the night like smoke, joining the ambient chorus of rustling armor and the occasional coo of a nesting dove tucked under a loose eave. The castle, for all its bristling battlements and fortified dignity, was very much alive, but never threatening. Not at night. Not when everyone coexisted in this semi-sleepy ecosystem of torchlight, murmured jokes, and distant clinks of iron boots. And as the stars spun softly overhead, you might hear the quietest sound of all. Someone, somewhere deep in the undercroft, tuning the strings of a lute in the dark. Not for performance, just for something to do. A tiny rebellion against the silence. A lullaby with no particular audience. Somewhere down in the stables, a horse dreams. The watchman yawns and straightens his back. And in the king's solar, a candle flickers beside parchment notes left unfinished. The night lingers, quiet and stitched with little sounds. And as we listen, we begin to wonder, what secrets might the kitchens be whispering into the hearth? Are spoons ever truly still? That, dear dreamer, is something we shall discover next. Inside the stone belly of the keep, night had settled like a heavy tapestry, thick and quiet, but for the occasional creak of timber and the soft rustle of straw-stuffed pallets adjusting under fidgeting limbs. Somewhere behind layers of ancient mortar, a clever mouse rehearsed its bid for eternal corridor supremacy, nibbling smugly near the larder. But tonight, our attention drifts upward, toward the battlements, high above the sleeping great hall, where the wind carried secrets and the guards carried a surprising number of onions. The night watch was the least glamorous of all castle duties, second only to chimney sweep apprentice, and person responsible for washing chainmail in winter. To be selected for the night rotation on the parapets was both an honor and a deeply unpleasant obligation. It required vigilance, exceptional eyesight, and a fondness for damp cloaks. 2 guards stood silhouetted atop the outer wall, looking not so much like noble sentinels defending the realm as hunched, insomniac storks. One of them, a man known simply as Oswin, because no one fancied the effort of remembering his last name, squinted into the horizon. The other, a sleepy lad named Hugh, who had recently mistaken the castle herald for a very large pigeon, leaned casually against a merlin and munched on a raw leek. "Anything?" Oswin asked, more out of tradition than genuine curiosity. "Moon's still up," Hugh replied, mouth full of allium-based regret. Oswin nodded. The moon had indeed stood vigil longer than either man. It illuminated the woods beyond the moat in silver shadows and made the turrets look like candle stubs in a waxy sky. Below, the drawbridge creaked faintly in the wind, its chains sighing like middle-aged knees. "Think the Welsh might come?" Hugh asked, nibbling the leek with the melancholic air of someone who rather preferred apples. "Highly unlikely," Oswin murmured. "They're not fond of midnight dreariness, nor climbing dry ditches for the sheer joy of skirmishing at awkward angles." "Still," Hugh said, shifting his weight with the grace of a slouching bookshelf, "lain in wait, they could be, behind a hill, or a particularly large rock. As could we all," Oswin replied philosophically, "but most prefer beds." And that was the honest truth, for medieval castles were filled with people spending considerable nocturnal energy, trying very hard not to be on top of walls, in the rain, calling out the all clear to nothing at all. Down below, the blacksmith's apprentice, a wiry youth with more ambition than common sense, was sleeping near the embers of the forge, having insisted he would keep it at the ready in case of sudden siege. His snoring sounded like someone trying to hammer a horseshoe underwater. Meanwhile, in the chapel, not quite atop the list of castle party destinations, a single candle burned beside the altar. The chaplain, a man who dreamed exclusively in Latin and cheese, often wandered in during the small hours to offer prayers for peace, a better grain harvest, and less unpleasant pew humidity. Back on the wall, Hugh startled suddenly. "Did you hear that?" "No," Oswin said, not even looking up. "Sounded like a distant horn, or maybe a goose in distress. Likely a trumpet in someone's dream, or a sleeping goose with indigestion." Silence returned briefly, broken only by the wind nudging at the battlements like a bored tutor. "Oswin." "Yes, Hugh?" "Do you ever think about joining a monastery instead? I hear they ring bells, eat figs, and do quite a lot of sitting." "Aye," Oswin replied wistfully, "but one does not simply stumble into fig-based enlightenment. You'd have to chant." "I could chant," Hugh declared firmly, then added after a beat, quietly. The guards resumed their mute vigil, interrupted now and then by the shifting of cloaks, the tap of a wooden bucket against stone, and the philosophical sighs of men who've seen 3 hedgehogs but never a single actual invasion. And so the castle eased deeper into its midnight hush. The fires dimmed to embers, the mice declared victory in the pantry, and somewhere in the knight's chamber, a nobleman muttered heroically in his sleep about turnips. Outside, the stars sharpened themselves into place above the turrets, watching as humans below tended to quiet lives woven from duty and drafty corridors. And just as the air turned cool enough to tempt Hugh into considering the monastic life again, a distant flutter sounded from the forest edge, a whisper of hooves. Not danger, no, but the kind of noise that promised the approach of something or someone. And that tale, wrapped in midnight mist and woolen cloaks, we must save for next time, somewhere beyond the 8th snore of the stable boy, and just north of the last sputtering torch in the east hallway, the castle's inner courtyard fell into one of its rare nocturnal silences, a hush so complete it almost felt suspicious, as if the very walls had drawn breath and were waiting to exhale. But don't worry. Within moments, the quiet was joyfully shattered by the unmistakable groaning of an overfed warhorse in its sleep, followed by the hiccup of a rather gassy chicken in the henhouse. Castles, you see, were never quite as silent as storybooks would have you believe. Much of the nighttime ambience, especially in the later medieval period, came courtesy of court musicians who lacked the good sense to stop practicing after the toll of vespers. Though considered the height of devotion, or perhaps just ambition, a few minstrels would sneak into side chambers or turrets to polish their lute skills under cover of night. The result? An oddly soothing symphony of slightly off-key strings, the occasional whispered curse when someone missed a note, and the low creak of wooden floors complaining under shifting, squatting musicians. A veritable lullaby orchestra, accidentally composed. Even higher up, near the topmost tower, the steward's cat skulked across the stone parapet, his paws making no sound, save for an occasional scatter of old pigeon feathers. Cats were considered practical defenders of grain stores and spiritual guardians against evil spirits, though notably, they were less enthusiastic about either role than they were about waiting until precisely 3 a.m. to howl like Scandi choirs echoing through a longboat. Meanwhile, in a lesser visited corner of the keep, between the buttery and an alarming-looking tapestry involving a saint, a goat, and far too much embroidery, the castle scribe was still awake. Scribes were a nocturnal breed, often called ink owls, by the guards who brought them warming ale and subtle reminders that humans, unlike Vikings, required sleep. Tonight, our ink owl dragged his quill across vellum, penning accounts of barley yields with a sort of heroic boredom only monastic training could produce. Occasionally, the more dignified portions of the castle tried to uphold some semblance of elegance, even at night. The great hall, though mostly abandoned by this hour, still smelled faintly of roasted meats and spilled mead, as though feast lingered in memory long after their participants had stumbled off to bed, or at least to the nearest wall to lean against. Tapestries rustled gently in the breeze sneaking in through ill-fitted shutters, depicting Norman knights locked in an eternal joust beneath the moonlight's disinterested gaze. Above it all, perched in the lantern tower, a lonely guard watched the horizon with the dazed expression of someone who had, quite frankly, seen far too many sheep in his lifetime. The official duty was to watch for invaders, but most of the time, the greatest threat to the castle was a particularly ambitious weather pattern. Tonight, the clouds were assembling an army of drizzle, slow, persistent, and only threatening to one's dry socks. And let us not forget the communal privy, located daringly along the outer wall, where echo and practical plumbing met in wild disarray. In night hours, it was both feared and revered. It was also the only part of the castle where foot traffic increased after midnight, as the effects of boiled cabbage dinners came into their late-night bloom. The place was very much alive in a creaky, sleepy, half-dreaming kind of way, like a dog kicking its legs against the floor while deep in pursuit of squirrels known only to its subconscious. Even stone walls, when lived in, begin to sigh and settle and sympathize. They remember the weight of laughter from the day, the clang of armor against flagstones, and the slow comfort of footsteps retreating toward bed. As the moon climbed higher, a gentle gust urged the weathered banners on the tower tops into lazy flutters. Somewhere beneath them, tucked behind the scullery's crooked window, the cook's apprentice mumbled in her sleep about peppercorns and which saints preferred lentils. All was well, unkempt, off-key, slightly gassy, but well. And slowly, just before another distant horse snore swept through the southern bailey, the castle exhaled again, stones, servants, and all, as midnight melted gently into whatever came next. As the moon waltzed higher in the sky, casting its silvery light across the moss-cloaked stones, the castle's kitchen hearth let out a final complaining hiss. It had been a long day of boiling things, charring things, salting things until they could legally be considered sculpture, and, most importantly, feeding a household whose definition of snack included half a roasted piglet and 3 loaves of trencher bread. By nightfall, the servants, a constellation of yawning silhouettes, had scurried away to their hay-filled sleeping nooks, leaving the kitchen nearly silent. Nearly. Because, as it turned out, cheeses do not sleep. Yes, nestled away in the cool pantry, enormous wheels of stubborn cheddar and wheels of blue-veined mysteries could occasionally be heard settling, groaning softly under their own portentous weight. It was a sound, halfway between a sigh and a squelch, and it could be deeply unsettling to the uninitiated. Indeed, more than one young scullery boy had bolted at midnight, certain the dairy was possessed by ghostly monks, which, to be fair, it probably was. The monks had made the cheese, and everyone knows medieval cheese retained memories. Now, the animals, those permanent bleating residents of the outer bailey, were not particularly interested in sleep schedules. Sheep murmured in their shaggy clusters, trading philosophical bars on fleecy matters lost to history. Chickens shifted irritably on their perches, farting feathers and dreaming anxious poultry dreams. And the pigs, ever practical, simply flopped into the mud with existential resignation. But above all that, rising into the night with a sort of gritty nobility, there was the castle gate, specifically the portcullis, a metal lattice of iron teeth, lowered like the frown of a particularly strict librarian. It creaked now and then in the wind, chains rattling in the slight breeze. It was the castle's version of a front door left slightly open, not enough to be inviting, but just enough to let dashy little night creatures scamper through and hold unauthorized parties under the drawbridge. Tonight, a fox with far more charisma than stealth had yet again infiltrated the courtyard. His high-step prance was more theatrical than practical, and though he considered himself a master thief, he was only marginally better than the average raccoon, who, in the medieval hierarchy of unlawful nibblers, were considered anarchists in fur coats. But the real mischief came from higher up. High in the castle rookery, a tower room that was more guano than stone, the messenger ravens made their opinions of bedtime known. Clicking and shifting in their wooden cages, they cast baleful glances at the moon and each other, as if plotting a union. These birds had carried messages across a cold, plague-riddled landscape all day, letters tied neatly to their scaly ankles, only to be put in a poop-crusted box by night. Frankly, they felt underappreciated. Down below, in one of the upper rooms of the keep, a chamberlain snored with the enthusiasm of a man who had spent the better part of the day counting spoons. His snores echoed through the wooden beams like the ghost of a tuba trapped in a wine barrel. A flickering tallow candle on his desk had nearly lost its will to live, drooping sideways and pooling wax in what could easily be construed as a mild cry for help. Across the corridor, in a moderately less draughty room that had aspirations of grandeur, a bard had fallen asleep mid-stanza. His lute rested delicately atop his belly, like a loyal wooden cat. By day he sang of great battles and questionable romantic subplots. By night, he dreamt of unruly rhymes that refused to scan, but nonetheless insisted upon being written. One could almost hear the poetry, trying to compose itself against the chamber walls. It nearly rhymed squire with mire before giving up and collapsing into slumber as well. And still, through all this soft din of nocturnal life, the wind swept gently through arrow slits, those defensive gaps in the stone, designed for bowmen, but now mostly serving as medieval air conditioning. It sang a muffled lullaby through the timbered roof beams, a tune passed down by decades of cold nights and poorly closed shutters. As the castle dreamed in stone and straw, a pair of young guards paced along the wall walk, their torches casting elongated shadows across the battlements. One of them, clutching a crusty bit of sausage left over from supper, glanced over the edge and asked, with all sincerity, "Do you think the moat's deep enough to hide from responsibility?" The other, yawning, replied, "Only if you swim fast and lie well." The torches hissed as wind plucked at the flames, and the creaking continued. Wood against stone, leather straps, ancient hinges, all joining in that nightly refrain, a chorus of gentle unrest. Just beyond the stables, a lull descended, and the castle settled again, bracing softly for what fresh cacophonies the final watches would bring. As another mystery unfolded beneath the west tower, as the torches dimmed in the stone corridors and the fire in the great hearth crackled down to its last red embers, the castle turned inwards. It didn't sleep exactly, not quite. It shuffled, snored, occasionally grumbled, and in one instance broke wind with such medieval vigour that a nearby sconce rattled softly against its bracket. But in the quiet heart of the fortress, in those hours long past supper and well before sunrise, the castle settled into its own kind of nighttime rhythm. The walls, if one listened carefully, exhaled warmth. Centuries of lichen, lime, and gossip had seeped into the stones, and now they murmured to one another in a slow, ancient hush. Meanwhile, high above, the crenellations lined up under a velvety moonlit sky like sleepy teeth. And tucked behind them, under an archer's tarp, one might find a dozing guard who had cleverly arranged his halberd in such a way that it could be shaken awake before he had to be. Inside, in the northwest parapet chamber, usually reserved for storing spare crossbow bolts and unwanted troubadours, two scribes debated ink ingredients at a whisper. It's what passed for excitement among medieval administrative assistants. One swore by crushed gallnut from Bartholomew's Grove, while the other, ever the rebel, preferred soot from the lesser chimney. A skirmish of quills could erupt at any moment, but decorum prevailed. Besides, no one wanted to wake the clerk-eater spider rumoured to reside in the rafters above. Not far off, the castle cat, known only as Lady Thistlewhisk, tested the acoustics of the stairwell with a piercing yowl, the sort of feline aria that makes monks reconsider their vows. She would then tiptoe away, her work complete, possibly in search of mice or simply to patrol the butter pantry, where she ruled as an unofficial duchess. The chapel bell had rung its last note hours earlier, sending a shimmer through the air like a sigh wrapped in metal. If you'd been awake to hear it, you might have mistaken it for peace, but an over-ambitious novice monk had eaten too much fish pie and was now mumbling theological apologies to the chamber pot. "Abbot, forgive me," he whimpered into the chilly dark. "Cod is my downfall." In the hallway, an elder monk considered intervening but decided against it, opting instead to quote psalms at the tapestry until he felt better. Below ground, in the damp, echo-fond bowels of the castle, the kitchens, old bread cooled beside a crock of pickled things, and rats exchanged coded peeps about a possible scone heist. The leftover scent of stew and onion lingered like the spirit of a grumpy cook who once threw a ladle at a nobleman. To this day, that dent on the far wall is considered sacred among the scullery maids. Meanwhile, in the chambers of Lady Imelth of Fernholt, a woman with hair like a woven russet river and a temper that had once scared a jousting horse halfway back to Kent, a fire sparkled low in the hearth as she penned a midnight letter. Her quill danced across the parchment in quiet rhythm, ink splotching only once when she sneezed and whispered a small courtly curse in Latin. She wasn't writing to a lover or a king, but to her cousin Edith, who'd foolishly eloped with a travelling mathematician. The letter contained both concern and a detailed critique of Edith's new wardrobe. Priorities. Along the outer bailey, the wind tugged gently at banners stiff with dew. Somewhere near the armoury, a chicken flapped down from its perch with the solemn dignity of a sentry completing its shift, and began pecking at invisible morsels with the conviction of a philosopher trying to find truth beneath gravel. The castle, ever so slightly, snored. It came from the Lord's hound, Balric, whose dreams often involved chasing imaginary hedgehogs through endless meadows of gravy. His paws twitched sweetly, moonlight catching the tips of his ears as he mumbled in his sleep, something that sounded suspiciously like sausages. Overhead, the stars huddled close against the cold black sky, blinking down upon ramparts and runnels, beams and battlements. The night grew thicker, like a woolen curtain being gently pulled across the stage of the world, and somewhere deep within the laundry room, a sock vanished, perhaps the first recorded case in a 1,000-year mystery. And in the silence that followed, not total but full of gentle creaks, of fluttery sighs and crackling wood, something shifted. A sense that morning lurked just beyond the drawbridge, not quite near enough to stir the roosters, but close enough to pay attention. Let us drift now to the East Tower, where a candle still burns, waiting for a traveller in the dark with a tale to tell. By now, the castle has settled into its peculiar version of serenity, a lullaby of groans, creaks, and medieval mumblings humming across the chilled stone walls. But do not be misled. Nightfall did not mute the castle. It simply changed its rhythm. Somewhere, several floors above the great hall, a chamber pot is being shuffled across the floor like a haunted tortoise. The shuffler, likely a squire with questionable aim and even more questionable shoes, is doing his best to avoid a repeat of last week's ceramic catastrophe that startled a raven into the chimney and resulted in Lady Elgafu discovering bird droppings in her bathwater. Again, elsewhere, in the buttery, which disappointingly stores neither butter nor croissants, a sleepy page boy named Roland curls himself atop a pile of barley sacks. He is wrapped in a wool cloak, roughly the consistency of potato skin. Roland talks in his sleep, whispering the names of horses he's never met, and arguing softly with himself about whether one can punch a ghost. Scholars remain undecided. Outside the thick castle walls, a cocky owl is mid-monologue. He does this every night, perches atop a gargoyle's nose, and delivers impromptu sermons to the courtyard, as though the livestock need spiritual guidance. He believes himself the reincarnation of a druid, and once tried to hypnotize a passing friar. The friar, stern and onion-breathed, threw a shoe at him. The owl was delighted. He has since written 37 screechy songs entitled Ode to the Sandal. Beneath the great hall, in the echoing belly of the kitchens, a different kind of symphony plays. The snores and wheezes of the night cook, Mad Lothar. No one knows if Lothar ever actually cooks, but each night, without fail, he falls asleep curled around a bread paddle like a medieval teddy bear, gently snoring flour into the air. Mice sit around him like disciples, waiting for crumbs or perhaps enlightenment. Up in the armory, where the cold air chews at your knuckles and everything smells faintly of oiled chainmail and regret, forgotten helmets murmur among themselves. Metal does tend to hum slightly in the night, especially when wound tight with the stories of clumsy squires and the occasional ghostly jester. One helmet is widely believed to be haunted by Sir Percival the Unfortunate, who attempted to joust a mirror and lost convincingly. And in the towers, the spiral staircase treading turrets that stretch upward like stone reeds, watchmen pace slowly in their wool cloaks, wrapped tighter than a nobleman's tax excuses. They peer into the one sky they know, eyes scanning for signs of raiders, revolts, or what they secretly hope might be dragons. There's always one guard who insists he saw a dragon in 1342, though every time he tells the story, it gains another wing and loses a few factual limbs. The guard dogs, bred for loyalty and uneven snoring, have done their rounds and now lie strewn across doorways like furry trip hazards. They dream of chicken bones and the time one of them got away with licking the bishop's ankle and escaped divine retribution. A true legend among canines. Somewhere, high in a tower chamber stuffed with manuscripts and waxy candle stubs, a monk bends over a vellum scroll, his quill scratching like a timid bat, Illumination, they call it. Those little painted creatures and saints framing the words. He's drawing a chicken wearing trousers on the corner of a psalm. Expression of divine mystery, he mutters, and poultry rights activism. The wind sings slightly through arrow slits, as if sniffing for forgotten songs. It slips into the chapel, rattling the ribs of the organ and startling the resident bat, who is named Gregory and believes himself the patron saint of echo-based navigation. As the stars gently patrol above, their cold light dancing off tower spires and mossy ramparts, the castle exhales all its dreams, muddy, marvellous, and mundane. Timber whispers, stones exhale the day's warmth, and somewhere in the stables, a knight with questionable digestion blames the horse. For all its noise, its grumbles and tweets and spectral mumblings, the castle is not awake. It is simply dreaming with its eyes half open. Tomorrow will bring trumpets, spilled porridge, and a noblewoman accusing a goose of witchcraft. But that's for another night. For now, let the gentle clatter of distant anvils, the soothing hiss of a snuffed torch, and the murmurs of medieval sleep draw you deeper still, into the final hush. By now, the fire in the castle's great hearth has dwindled to a low and trusting glow, its last remaining embers painting orange shadows across old stone walls. Everyone who was meant to sleep has finally done so, though some snore like heraldic war horns, and the castle has settled into its richest silence. It's a quiet that isn't quite silence at all. It's the kind only medieval buildings know. The sound of wood beams sighing in their joints, of distant rustling from the hayloft, of a loyal donkey in the stables murmuring in its dreams. Even the suits of armour lining the passage near the chapel seem to exhale in peace. Though who's to say what dreams haunt a helmet? The knight who once wore it, or the stable boy who polished it until it reflected moonlight. Outside, the moat is a still ink-stained ring, dotted with the occasional ripple from a night lizard or a sleepwalking duck. You may think ducks don't sleepwalk, but that would be historically short-sighted. Medieval ducks were hardy, nocturnal, and sometimes philosophical. Monks reported instances of ducks refusing to go south for winter out of sheer stubbornness. A few even nested near cathedrals, perhaps chasing enlightenment or breadcrumbs. The line between the two often blurred beneath starlight. Behind the thick curtain walls, in the bailey, the open courtyard space, everything lies hushed under the watchful eye of moonbeams. A wooden cart abandoned for the night still creaks, ever so slightly, as if remembering an argument it had with a wheelbarrow during the day. A black cat winds its way from shed to smithy, keeping suspicious order. You might picture medieval castles as loud by day and silent by night, but in truth, the rhythm of life never quite stopped. Guards on the night watch, called watchmen, not because they wear wristwatches, those came centuries later, but because their job was literally to watch, pace the ramparts. Their boots thud in slow, repetitive fashion, a lullaby in leather and iron. Occasionally, a torch sputters in protest against the breeze, and sometimes a sleepy guard sings softly to himself, a song with more feeling than pitch, often improvised, involving love, ale, and highly inaccurate observations of the moon. There is comfort in mediocrity, especially under stars. Down in the kitchens, the last warmth lingers in the bread ovens, which are still humming like satisfied bellies. A tired cook, long since overtaken by gravity, dozes with half a turnip in his lap and a ladle in his hand, like a knight's scepter. The battle against stew will resume in the morning. And somewhere beneath all this stillness, in the belly of the castle, Deep in the food cellars hangs rows of drying herbs and strings of pungent garlic, each bulb shaped like a sleepy drop of moonlight. In the medieval mind, garlic kept more than vampires at bay. It was believed to safeguard the soul, the stomach, and one's social calendar. A clove a day kept not only the undead away, but also suitors, co-workers, and everyone else with a functioning nose. Across the stone floor above those cellars lies the chapel. Even at midnight, a candle glows there, not to light anything useful, but simply because someone once declared that the sacred should never go completely dark. A vow that stuck for centuries, as good vows tend to do. In the Lord's chamber, beneath embroidered tapestries telling fables of gold, dragons, and suspiciously muscular saints, the Lord and Lady of the castle sleep. First, they performed the ritual medieval bedtime routine, checking the locks on the doors, negotiating a truce with the cat, and mumbling blessings that included, "May no arrows find us," and "May no rats invade the grain stores." Their pillows are lumpy, and their dreams are soft. History is not often kind to its sleepers, but tonight it lets them rest. Now even the battlements, those stony shoulders holding the castle together, seem to sag just a little, as though all walls need rest too. And you, dear wanderer of history's quieter corridors, you've made it through the clanging armor and the echoing flagstones, through creaking drawbridges and the eternal complaints of chamber pots. You've heard the whisper of the walls and the lullaby of torchlight. So let yourself drift with the echo of distant bells and slippered footsteps. Let each sigh of timber and snort of dreaming livestock ease you deeper into sleep. The castle is quiet, and you, finally, are home.